welcome back for episode 3. I am Emily Huff, and today in Intro to Psychology we will be discussing biology and behavior, talking a little bit about the brain and some of the chemicals involved in your psychology and how your brain can impact psychology. So this is a little bit of a scientific chapter, a lot of anatomy and science-related terms, but it's all going to pop up for the rest of this course. We will talk about different neurotransmitters and the way that the brain operates and perceives information. So it's important to get a little bit of a handle on everything. Obviously, there's so much that your brain and your central nervous system does. It is impossible for me to teach you in 4 days in a chapter something that really could be a year-long course, these four days. So we'll just try to get the basics down and kind of go from there. As far as psychology goes, I'm going to start by talking about Tom Cruise and Brooke Shields and the debate that happened, must be like 15 years ago by now, because it kind of highlights an important question. To what extent are psychological problems or psychological issues related to science and biology? And to backtrack this for you, Brooke Shields is a famous actress, and she was very public about her postpartum depression and how she went to therapy and took antidepressants to help her through depression. So it really, from that point on, I feel people have been a lot more out front in the media talking about depression and different psychological issues, which is nice just to get it out in the open. It's not so closeted and hidden anymore. So anyway, she's talking about depression, and it led people to kind of ask questions about depression, and is it real? I'm going to say quote-unquote real, because this was a discussion I remember happening when I was in high school. People not actually thinking that depression was a real problem. It was just in your head. You're just in a bad mood. You're just feeling down. There was no science behind it. And Tom Cruise has some different religious and scientific beliefs that are his own, but he was extremely vocal about not believing in the science behind depression. He went on the Today Show and had a little confrontation with Matt Lauer. I'm just going to play a little bit of that for you here.
You know what Adderall is? Do you know Ritalin? Do you know now that Ritalin is a street drug? Do you understand that?
The difference is,
Madam, I'm asking you a question.
I understand there's abuse of all of these things.
No, you see, here's the problem. You don't know the history of psychiatry. I do.
Aren't there examples, and might not Brooke Shields be an example of someone who benefited from one of those drugs?
All it does is mask the problem, Matt. And if you understand the history of it, it masks the problem. That's what it does. That's all it does. You're not getting to the reason why. There is no such thing as a chemical imbalance.
So there's two things. Two things I'm going to highlight about what Tom Cruise said there. And I don't care if you disagree or agree with him. I'm just using him as an example right now. Where he says that sometimes these drugs can mask the problem. I do think that that's obviously something for a therapist to be concerned about. If you have depression, simply taking the medication, you're not getting to the root of the problem, and so that's why therapy is also important. So by taking just a pill and not actually dealing with your depression, yes, I what he's trying to say there, I do understand what he's saying. He follows it up by saying there's no such thing as a chemical imbalance, and that's when we have to step in with psychological data and show him what is in Chapter 2 of your textbook and talk about the actual neurotransmitters that we have, and there is evidence that these chemical imbalances can lead to some psychological issues. Most notably, the neurotransmitter I want you guys to be most familiar with is serotonin. Serotonin is kind of the happy neurotransmitter. It is your neurotransmitter that boosts your mood and makes you feel like you're in a happy mood. And what we find in patients with depression is low levels of serotonin or low acting levels of serotonin. So we do see some sort of chemical imbalances. Some of the research you have to be careful. Are we talking about a correlation, or are we talking about cause and effect? You got to look at the research for that. But serotonin is sort of your happy neurotransmitter. Going along with that, there's a clip from a wonderful movie called Legally Blonde that I'll play for you here. It's about the importance of endorphins.
I just don't think Brooke could have done this. Exercise gives you endorphins. Endorphins make you happy. Happy people just don't shoot their husbands. They just don't.
It's very true. So in that same sort of thing, you got serotonin as a happy transmitter or a neurotransmitter. Endorphins are hormones that you have within your brain and your nervous system that have different sort of physiological functions. And one of the things endorphins do is to kind of pump you up. They also can make you sort of immune to pain and things like that, which is why if you have a lot of adrenaline and endorphins in your body during a sporting event, you might be less likely to feel the impacts of pain and things like that. So we find there is chemical evidence, these chemical things in your body and your brain that do impact your psychology. So that is an important part of our chapter. We talked a little bit in class, or we will, about using your whole brains. And there's this myth that we actually don't use all of our brain. And we talk about every single part of your brain serves a purpose in just basic human life. So, of course, you are using all of your brain. We do use all of the brain. Einstein actually has a wonderful quote about this whole "we don't use our whole brain" thing, and he said we used to use it as an excuse to genius. Why people would be like, Einstein, why are you such a genius? And he would always say to them, I'm not a genius. It's just most people don't use all of their brain. And so over time, some people believe this myth began with Einstein, Albert Einstein. Over time, people were like, we could all be like Einstein if we actually used our whole brain. But that was just sort of something Einstein said back in the day to make people feel good about themselves. Why can't we be like Einstein? Because you're not using your whole brain, but in fact, we are. And I don't know if this really fits in with what we're talking about in our chapter, but I found this information was interesting, that the brain, your actual brain, represents 3% of your body weight, typically, but yet the brain uses 20% of the body's energy. So if you just think of how much energy is being controlled by such a small percentage of your body, when we're talking about the brain, really sort of drives home the power and the impact of what is going on inside your head and in also your central nervous system, which is attached to your brain. So please take care of your brains, and thanks for taking Intro to Psychology to help grow your brain. I want to end today with just a note about how we are constantly learning more about the brain and its impacts in psychology by talking about a topic that is out there right now called chronic traumatic encephalopathy, which is otherwise known as CTE, and that is dealing with, you'll hear about it in the news a lot about football players, but it kind of is just how concussions and trauma to the head over time, like even in little small increments, even if you don't have a full-blown concussion, just how repeated, I can't think of a softer word than trauma right now, but bashing, jolting of the head, the problems that it can cause psychologically down the road. And I want to bring this up in this podcast because it is just a huge question mark. We don't know. You think about everything we do know in psychology, and then you get to an area like this, and there's so much that we don't know. So there's still so much we have to uncover. And just like, 20 years ago when Tom Cruise was talking about antidepressants, how much we've learned in 20 years about depression is fascinating. I feel like in the next 20 years with CTE, people will maybe listen back to this podcast and be like, how did she not know what CTE? We don't know. We're still learning about the psychological effects of that. The brain and your body in general, technically, are marvelous mysteries of science and psychology. And so we were constantly finding new information, which is a really exciting part about psychology, is it's constantly evolving, and there's room for us to discuss new things almost every single day because we're finding out so much more information. So stay tuned for some new updates on your brain and biology. I'm sure new things will come to light throughout this chapter. And if you have questions about any of this, you let me know, and thank you very much for listening.